You banned who? From what? That's like telling a black hole it's too disruptive. The lecture hall erupted in hoots and clicks. A dozen species, each in their own bioluminescent or chitinous way, expressed the same thing. Laughter. Mocking laughter. The kind that didn't hide its condescension. Professor Gorlunt let his 6 eyes blink independently, a slow sign of disapproval among the Thrixie. He adjusted his translator node and leaned forward over the podium. I assure you this was a serious decision made by the Interstellar Academy Board. Humans have been officially barred from attending any advanced combat training modules or simulations on shared campuses. Another wave of mirth rolled through the students. A young VROL student, his shimmering fronds twitching with smugness, raised a flipper. Professor, with respect, are we really pretending the humans earned such a distinction? They barely passed the neural interface tests. They still burn hydrocarbons in some regions. And you're telling us they're too dangerous for a training sim? Several tentacles, antennae, and cranial fins nodded in agreement. Exactly, another student shouted. This one was a Raxan, all horns and spiraling bone armor. My species thrives on combat. We've been warring across systems for centuries, but no one's banned us. Humans flinch at loud sounds, added a lean Saracen from the rear. My cousin visited their homeworld and said one of them passed out during a thunderstorm. The students broke into more laughter, some pounding the seats with glee. Professor Gorlunt waited, patient, still. When the room quieted again, he brought up a hollow screen behind him. No, they were not banned because they were incompetent, he said. They were banned because every time they participate in a simulation, the program either crashes or gets rewritten by accident. When we tried to isolate the variables, we found it was never an equipment malfunction. He tapped his claw against the lectern. It was the humans, just them, always them. But why? Asked the Vrol. What could possibly be so disruptive? They're not psychic, not physically dominant, and certainly not disciplined. The holoscreen blinked. Gorlunt selected a file. I had a feeling today's session would go this way, so I prepared a sample. This footage is from Simulation 12B- Human Cadet Maxwell participating in a first-year squad-based urban sweep scenario. This recording is classified, but the Academy Board has granted permission for educational use. The lights dimmed. On screen, a group of armored trainees move through a crumbling city street under a virtual twilight. Cadet Maxwell, a stocky, unshaven man with a perpetually squinting expression, walked behind the team, humming. Yes, humming. Is he singing? Someone muttered. Maxwell's voice was off-key, and the song unrecognizable, but it echoed in the tight canyon of debris. As the rest of the team moved in standard formation, checking corners, Maxwell stopped to pick up a brick. Then he pocketed it. Why did he do that? Asked the Raxan. Wait, Gorlunt said. Moments later, a simulation ambush sprang, a synthetic enemy force pouring from side alleys. The other cadets reacted as trained. Cover, call-outs, suppression fire. Maxwell? He ducked behind a burned-out vehicle, hurled the brick, then sprinted at the attackers. The playback slowed. The brick hit the first enemy's faceplate, which cracked. Maxwell leapt over the hood of the vehicle, drove his elbow into the next attacker, took their rifle mid-motion, and used it to bludgeon a third. Why is he not using the sim-issued sidearm? Asked a puzzled instructor in the old footage. He never drew it, Gorlunt narrated. What is he doing with that fire hydrant? Another voice murmured. Indeed, Maxwell had wrenched the cap off a virtual hydrant and was now using it to flood a corridor, effectively washing out a reinforced sniper position. Then, with a delighted yell, he belly-flopped onto a plank and surfed the water stream downhill into a market square, colliding with 2 more enemies. The room was silent. In the footage, Maxwell stood panting in the middle of simulated wreckage. His armor was scorched. 1 boot was missing. He had a mop handle in one hand and someone's dropped helmet in the other. He looked confused. Wait, was that the final wave? He asked the camera. Yes, came the flat response. You neutralized all threats. Simulation ending. Maxwell nodded, then picked up a can of virtual tuna and walked off screen. The lights in the lecture hall came back up. Gorlunt faced the silent class. That was an unmodified recording. No enhancements, no programming deviations. Every other cadet followed protocol. Maxwell broke formation, ignored his gear, used improvised weapons, and achieved total scenario clearance 36 seconds ahead of simulation baseline optimal. A long silence. Then the Syrinx, eyes wide, whispered, "He played it like a game." "Yes," Gorlin said. And when we asked him why, he said, and I quote, "I just did what made sense at the time." One of the Vrol students twitched his fronds nervously. That kind of unpredictability, it's not a tactic, it's not teachable, Gorlin finished for him, which is why they were banned, not for failure, but because the Academy's simulations are designed to model rules-based, logical engagement scenarios. And humans break rules not out of rebellion, but because they barely notice them. The class fell into murmured discussion. Some leaned back, clearly rethinking their earlier ridicule. Others furrowed their brows, reptilian, avian, or segmented, in contemplation. Gorlin folded his arms behind his back. Next week, we'll be reviewing Simulation 17C, in which human cadet Ortega disabled a siege engine with barbecue sauce and a curtain rod. Class dismissed. A week passed, but the murmurs never stopped. The footage had been viewed on private devices, passed through data slates, and even reconstructed in holographic replays. Human cadet Maxwell had gone from laughingstock to legend in less than a day, and nobody was sure how to process it. Not because of his success, but because of how casual it had been. Threx, the Vrol student who had once mockingly described humans as thunder-sensitive apes, now sat rigidly in his seat. The lights dimmed again. Professor Gorlin entered with a data rod in hand and no humor in his voice. "Simulation 17C, he said. "This one was never meant for public viewing. After reviewing last week's session, the board hesitated, but ultimately agreed this too qualifies as educational material." Threx shifted. Was it Maxwell again? Number Cadet Ortega. A quiet shuffle passed through the room. The holoscreen blinked on. The image showed a simulated battlefield. Dust-choked trenches, artillery emplacements, and overhead drones casting long shadows across no man's land. The objective was clear: disable a siege platform located at the far end of the canyon within 45 minutes. Every cadet had access to drones, coordinated recon, and precision ordnance. Then the feed zoomed in on Ortega. He stood near the rear of his squad, balancing a curtain rod on one shoulder and dragging a small satchel behind him. His uniform was regulation, but his stance wasn't. He bounced slightly on his heels as if waiting for a bus. "What's in the satchel?" someone asked. "Condiments," Gorlin replied. "Excuse me?" "Barbecue sauce, mustard packets, and one bottle of synthetic hot sauce." Laughter threatened to bubble up again, but no one dared. They remembered what had happened last time. The squad advanced. Drones flew ahead, providing live telemetry. As others flanked and engaged in textbook maneuvers, Ortega peeled off and disappeared into a collapsed farmhouse. His vitals stayed green. The sim logs showed he remained in the structure for 8 minutes. "What's he doing in there?" Threx asked, his tone cautious now. "Cooking," Gorlin said. Indeed, when the feed resumed, Ortega emerged carrying a sizzling mess of protein rations on a flat tray fashioned from a broken wall panel. Steam rose from the pile, smothered in dark red sauce. Ortega approached the siege platform, alone. The simulation enemy, a Class 5 autonomous turret emplacement, detected him instantly. "Warning," the system voice said. "You are entering a restricted zone." Ortega didn't flinch. He set the tray down, waved at the turret, and slowly backed away. A long pause. Then the turret beeped. Scanned, adjusted its targeting vector, and powered down. "What?" said half the class. Gorlin brought up a zoomed-in view of the turret's feed. Internal diagnostics were flagging sensor contamination, heat bloom, scent disruption, motion confusion. The platform, interpreting the meal as a potential trap or interference object, entered diagnostic lockdown. 3 seconds later, Ortega sprinted in, jammed the curtain rod into a panel seam, and leveraged it until the maintenance hatch blew off. "He didn't fight it," the Syrinx student muttered. "He confused it." "Yes," Gorlin replied, "because he knew it was never built to expect generosity or meals mid-battle. He used basic pattern-breaking behavior. The same logic behind camouflage, but with behavior instead of visuals. One of the Vlexi, who had been silent all term, finally raised a limb. "Sir, forgive the question, but how are we supposed to counter that?" "That," Gorlin said, "is precisely the problem. Most simulations are calibrated around predictability. Human cadets disregard standard tactical doctrine, not out of malice, but because their brains prioritize results over process. They do not separate combat from improvisation or survival from performance, and that creates variables our systems were never built to accommodate." Threx leaned forward, a slow pulse of blue moving through his fronds. "But if their approach works, why ban them? Why not make them the standard?" Gorlin's eyes narrowed. "Because their presence warps the curve, other cadets try to emulate them. Discipline collapses, risk-taking rises, control erodes, and before long, simulations become less about testing scenarios and more about surviving humans." He changed the holoscreen again. A statistical graph appeared, training outcomes before and after human inclusion. Once humans entered the mix, casualty simulations skewed erratically, victory margins widened unnaturally, and peer performance dropped. "Cadet Ortega didn't just win," Gorlin continued. "He changed how others tried to win. Some began bringing non-regulation items to simulations. One recruit attempted to use a rubber duck as a distraction device. Another built a makeshift trebuchet using a mop and cafeteria chairs." Threx's voice was low. "They broke the game." "They broke the frame of thought the game operates in," Gorlin corrected, "and that's far more dangerous." Silence gripped the room again. Then a hand rose. Clarn, a quiet Chiron student who rarely spoke. His insectoid voice buzzed softly. "What happens if humans don't stop?" Gorlin looked at him. "That's what the Council wants to prevent. Not because humans are evil, not because they seek conquest, but because if enough species begin thinking like them, the entire system of order we've built might change." He shut off the screen. No final words. No dramatic exit. The lights came back on. Nobody moved. 2 days later, the students were restless. Every casual conversation in the mess halls, transport pods, and study orbs circled back to the humans. Some still scoffed, claiming the examples were flukes, borderline comedic anomalies. But others, especially those studying military command and adaptive theory, began to question everything they'd ever been taught. That's when the security breach happened. It started as a whisper. Someone had accessed a restricted archive, a third simulation file never intended for classroom release. Not a recording this time, but a live feed, real-time, unfiltered, raw. The entire lecture wing gathered without an official summons. Screens across the walls lit up, all pulling from the same unauthorized source. The label on the top right corner read, "Simulation 23X, Human Cadet S. Durand. Unscheduled entry. Security flagged." Gorlunt stormed into the room moments later, antennae rigid with fury. "Shut this down! This is not a drill. That file was never cleared." But he froze when he saw the room, silent, still, every species locked onto the screen. He stopped barking orders. On the feed, Cadet Durand crouched in a forest simulation, alone, unarmed. His gear pack was missing, and his locator beacon was smashed. The scenario? Planetary crash survival, supposed to be run with a full squad. Durand had voluntarily entered it solo. The environment was harsh, cold. Rain hissed off the leaves. Predators, virtual but lethal, moved in the treetops. The sim was dialed to its highest difficulty setting. Durand moved calmly, not quickly. He tied vines together, gathered rocks, used tree sap to glue them into what looked like a crude bola. The simulation clock ticked down. According to parameters, the evac shuttle would arrive in 27 minutes, only if a signal beacon was manually reactivated at the crash site 2 kilometers away. "Why hasn't he sprinted for it?" a Saracen muttered. "He doesn't know where the predators are," Gorlin said. "He's baiting them." True enough, moments later, a sleek, panther-like drone lunged from the branches. Durand didn't flinch. He flung the bola. It wrapped around the drone's head, destabilizing its sensors. While it flailed, Duran ran, straight into the path of two more. Someone gasped, but instead of engaging, Duran dropped to the ground, rolled under their legs, and shoved handfuls of something into their intake vents. The drones spasmed, venting smoke. "What did he shove into them?" a Chiron buzzed. "Wasp nests," Gorlant muttered, jaw tight. The students turned toward him. Simulation was set on the Anduril jungle model. Those nests cause thermal overload in the drone circuits if ruptured inside the intake paths. But that's not in the briefing. He figured it out. Or guessed. On screen, Duran reached the crash site. The beacon lay across a clearing, but a giant quadrupedal sentry drone, one not even part of the standard scenario, had stationed itself there. An admin must have added it after seeing how far Duran had progressed. "Someone's testing him," Threx whispered. Duran didn't reach for a weapon. He climbed a tree, threw a chunk of bark in one direction, waited, then urinated down the trunk in the opposite direction. "What in the Saracen said. The bark distracted the drone for a moment, and the scent misled its biological scanner. While it hesitated, Duran leapt. He used a splintered branch to wedge open a panel on the beacon, bypassed the damaged transmitter, and connected a vine directly to the manual override. The beacon flared to life. The drone snapped around, charged. Duran didn't run. He dropped flat against the mud, pulled a thermal cloak over himself, just a square of insulating foil tied with broken bootlaces, and went still. The drone stopped, scanned, moved on. Seconds later, the sim ended. A siren wailed through the lecture wing. Unauthorized access, file breach, disciplinary committee inbound. But nobody moved, not even Gorlant. Threx was the first to speak. "That was impossible." "No," Gorlant said quietly. "That was human." He stepped forward. His tone had changed, no longer furious, just tired. That simulation was tampered with. Increased threat levels, denied standard equipment. It should have failed him. "But it didn't," said Clarn, "because he stopped playing by its design." Gorlant nodded once. "And that is why we don't let them train with you. Not because they're superior, not because they're monsters, but because they see these trials differently. Where others see rules, humans see tools. Where others react, humans adapt. Every scenario you've been taught to master, they disassemble." A long silence passed, then a voice from the back. "But isn't that what war requires?" Gorlant didn't answer, because deep down, he knew the real answer wasn't something any academy, council, or simulation could prepare them for. They tried to scrub the footage. Within hours of the breach, the Interstellar Academy servers were locked down. The 23rd X file was quarantined, encrypted, and flagged for deletion. An emergency tribunal convened behind sealed doors. Faculty were instructed not to speak of what they'd seen. And the students. They were warned, formally and with stern diplomatic phrasing, that unauthorized viewing or distribution of Academy material would result in immediate dismissal. But it was too late. The footage had already gone viral. Not on the standard networks, of course. Those were controlled. But on the sublayers, the encrypted data burrows where curious minds and rebellious instincts thrived. Duran versus the Impossible Sim became the most replayed unauthorized file in 2 solar cycles. Some students watched it out of awe, others out of disbelief. A few watched it to find flaws, loopholes, or tricks. No one found any. By the end of the week, the lesson had become clear. Humans weren't just unpredictable. They unwrote predictions. Not because they had superior tech or telepathic command. Most of them barely understood half the schematics they were issued. But they had something else. A weird, dangerous refusal to see problems the same way everyone else did. The next session in Professor Gorlant's class was the first time in years that the hall filled 30 minutes early. Even the normally smug upper-level combat cadets, who rarely respected theory sessions, arrived in silence. Gorlant entered with none of his usual ceremony. No assistant, no notes, just a single portable screen clutched in his lower hand. He placed it on the lectern and addressed the class. "I've been told not to show you this." Several students leaned forward. "I was told not to show you Maxwell or Ortega, and certainly not Durand. I defied those orders because I believe your education should reflect reality, not just regulation." He tapped the screen. The final file loaded. "What is this one called?" Clarn asked from the front row. Gorlin answered without looking up. "It has no designation. This file was never part of a training curriculum. It was a live, unscripted field mission recorded on a human vessel, accidentally picked up by a surveillance satellite. It wasn't meant to be educational material, but once you've seen it, you'll understand everything." The holoscreen flared to life. The footage was low resolution, grainy, with occasional audio distortion. It showed the interior of a Terran deep space mining freighter, old, rusted, barely flight rated. Inside, 3 human men sat around a table. One of them, lean and balding, was drawing something on a napkin. The second one was asleep. The third stared at a glowing monitor. Suddenly, alarms blared. External threat. Unauthorized boarding detected. The men didn't panic. The balding one stood up, tossed the napkin aside, and walked to a panel. The others followed, stretching as if they'd been summoned to a card game, not a potential firefight. The ship shook. Air pressure equalized. The attackers were forcing entry. No visible weapons. No battle stations. Instead, the humans picked up improvised tools. A wrench, a length of pipe, and a lunch tray. Gorlin paused the footage. Interceptors from the Scythian Syndicate boarded this vessel. 8 of them. Genetically engineered raiders. They carried neural disruptors and tactical shields. The humans knew the Syndicate took no prisoners. He resumed playback. The fight wasn't elegant, it was barely organized. The humans yelled instructions, threw objects, and used the ship itself as a weapon, slamming doors, triggering vents, flooding corridors with steam. One of them sprayed hydraulic fluid onto the floor, causing 2 invaders to slip. Another shut down gravity for 3 seconds and tackled a raider midair. In under 6 minutes, the boarding party was incapacitated. The screen froze on the last frame. The humans, sweaty and bruised, leaning against the corridor walls, laughing. Gorlunt turned back to his students. No training, no coordination, no formal leadership, and they won. Why? Clarn raised a claw. Because they don't separate real from simulation. Every moment is treated like it matters. Threk spoke up too. Because they don't believe in fair fights. They believe in winning, even if it looks stupid. Another student added, because they don't wait for orders. They improvise instinctively. Gorlunt nodded slowly. Yes, all of that, which is why humanity was banned from formal combat training. They don't follow doctrine. They rewrite it mid-stride. We built simulations to teach cooperation, predictability, controlled escalation. Humans break all of those. He powered down the screen, and that's why the Council fears them. A long silence stretched across the hall. Nobody laughed, nobody whispered. Then Clarn said quietly, "But they're still out there. They're still part of the Alliance." "Yes," Gorlunt replied. "We can't remove them, nor should we. But we must understand what they are. Not warriors, not monsters, not machines." He stepped away from the lectern and faced the room one last time. They're the species that made war weird. And in a galaxy built on predictable patterns, that makes them the most dangerous ally we've ever had.